Imagine living in a world where every word you speak, every glance you make, and every action you take is being watched. Not by cameras, not by police, but by your neighbors, your family, your priest, even the baker at the market. In medieval Europe, this was not paranoia, it was reality. Nothing was private, not your thoughts, not your meals, not your prayers. And if you stepped out of line, the consequences could be worse than death. Nothing in medieval life was truly private. By the time open violence began to lose its effectiveness, authority learned a more sustainable method of control: constant observation. Not always through guards or soldiers, but through people themselves. Surveillance became social, religious, and psychological. The medieval world quietly transformed everyday life into a monitored space where behavior was judged, remembered, and reported. This surveillance did not rely on advanced technology, it relied on fear, habit, and community pressure. Everyone watched everyone else, and everyone knew they were being watched. The psychological effects were profound. People were not just careful, they were trained from birth to perform obedience as a survival mechanism. Parishes became the first information networks. Priests were not merely spiritual leaders, they were the eyes and ears of authority. They knew who attended services, who arrived late, who skipped holy days, who confessed regularly, and who hesitated in prayer. Absence was suspicious, consistency was proof of loyalty. Religious participation became evidence of morality and obedience. Missing one service could be interpreted as defiance. Confession amplified the control. People reveal their fears, desires, and resentments. Even when priests maintained secrecy, patterns emerged. Someone who confessed anger toward authority or doubts about doctrine was quietly noted. These mental records were invisible, but acted as early intelligence files. Over time, this information could be mobilized to punish, intimidate, or manipulate. Trust eroded at every level of society. Neighbors became observers and enforcers. Communities were tightly packed with shared wells, ovens, markets, and streets. Deviations from expected behavior were immediately noticed. A stranger in town was under suspicion. A person acting differently from established norms could spark gossip, reports, or accusations. Authorities encouraged reporting. Failing to do so was a sin, a moral failing. Even families were not safe havens. Children were indoctrinated into religious and social norms from a very early age. Obedience was praised, curiosity was discouraged. Family conversations were censored subconsciously. A careless remark could travel beyond the household. In this world, everyone was a potential informant, even children. Homes offered no true refuge. Daily behavior was regulated through custom, law, and religious expectation. Clothing signaled morality. Too much decoration could indicate pride or vanity. Poverty was tolerated, but standing out visually could attract suspicion. Fashion became a social control mechanism, a visual way to enforce obedience. Food choices were monitored both socially and religiously. Fasting rules dictated when and what people could eat. Violating these rules publicly was a marker of impiety. Even private consumption carried risks if observed. Bodies became evidence of compliance or transgression. The act of eating was political, religious, and socially regulated. Speech was one of the most dangerous realms. Jokes, songs, and storytelling were scrutinized. Humor that challenged authority or mocked religion could result in punishment. Oral culture, which once served to unify communities, became dangerous. People learned to censor themselves, to avoid drawing attention. Silence became safer than expression. Markets and workplaces were similarly controlled. Guilds monitored not only professional skill, but moral behavior. Reputation depended on conformity, obedience, and religious compliance as much as craftsmanship. Masters and employers often acted as enforcers, sometimes without formal authority. Compliance became performative. Punishment for deviation reinforced the surveillance system. Public shaming, fines, forced penance, and exclusion taught lessons. These punishments didn't have to be severe, they only needed to be visible. Observers learned from watching others, and fear circulated faster than punishment itself. People internalized discipline, performing obedience before authority even asked for it. This system required almost no constant enforcement. People corrected themselves. They avoided risk. Over time, surveillance became invisible because it existed inside the mind. The fear of being watched mattered more than actual observation. Social control became self-regulation. People measured themselves, constantly calibrating actions, thoughts, and words to align with expected norms. This constant pressure reshaped identity. Individuals stopped asking whether actions were true, just, or right. They asked whether actions were safe. Moral judgment was replaced by risk assessment. Survival required predictability, conformity, and constant vigilance. Independent thought became a liability. Innovation and creativity suffered under this climate. New ideas meant attention. Attention meant danger. Many potentially transformative discoveries were stifled, not because people lacked imagination, but because imagination was unsafe. Silence, repetition, and adherence became the safest strategies. Those most vulnerable were the poor, the foreign, and the socially marginalized. Differences in appearance, speech, or behavior made them immediately noticeable. Surveillance converted natural human variation into a liability. Vulnerability equaled suspicion. Being noticed often meant guilt. Records, both oral and written, compounded this control. Notes about behavior, accusations, and confessions accumulated over time. People could live quietly for years, only to have past suspicions revived during crises. Retrospective punishment was a tool of power. The past was never forgotten, and memory was weaponized. Authority perfected control not through constant force, but through constant observation. The result was a society where fear was internalized. Citizens didn't need to be policed actively, they policed themselves. Obedience became instinctual. Deviance became invisible before it could manifest. Even when cracks appeared, through forests, travel, pilgrimages, or secret meetings, surveillance adapted. Authority relied on fear of exposure and the inevitability of discovery, not constant presence. Knowing someone could be watching was enough to shape behavior. This invisible system of control was perhaps the most effective mechanism medieval rulers, clergy, and elites ever developed. People were born into it, never experiencing freedom as a baseline. Control became normalized. Surveillance felt like community. Fear felt like order. And as generations passed, these social mechanisms were inherited silently, becoming cultural DNA. The sixth erased secret of medieval history, therefore, is this: control was perfected not through violence, but through the careful orchestration of observation, fear, and internalized obedience. Everyone watched, everyone feared, everyone hid themselves. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. Individuality was suppressed, creativity curbed, and human behavior meticulously molded from childhood onward. And once a population learns to hide its thoughts, the next hidden danger emerges. Truth itself becomes unsafe. When reality is dangerous to acknowledge, people stop speaking it aloud. Perception and belief replace evidence and observation. This is the world that would shape medieval societies for centuries, one where fear was invisible but total, and survival demanded not courage but silence. Trust in medieval society was not an assumption, it was a strategic decision. The very concept of loyalty was conditional, fragile, and constantly tested. Unlike today, where trust is often assumed in personal relationships, medieval communities lived under a perpetual calculus of risk. People learned to assess intentions, monitor behaviors, and measure loyalties constantly. Families, normally thought of as safe havens, were no exception. Children were indoctrinated into obedience from birth. Parents taught moral codes and social rules, but often emphasized survival over truth or individuality. Obedience was rewarded. Curiosity and independent thought were discouraged. A child's words could reflect on the family as a whole. Missteps were punished collectively, reinforcing compliance. Even intimate relationships carried danger. Marriage was not always a union of love, but a tool for alliance, inheritance, and political stability. Husbands and wives were under constant social scrutiny. Infidelity was one threat, but deviation from social norms, improper speech, or heretical belief could provoke punishment. Trust within these unions was conditional. Each party had to navigate social pressures while maintaining appearances. Neighbors acted as informal enforcers. Communities were close-knit, yet fraught with tension. Gossip was a mechanism of social control. Reporting suspicious behavior was encouraged and required. Those who failed to observe or report risked being suspected themselves. Medieval society was tightly controlled. Authorities, both secular and religious, monitored behavior, dictated access to resources, and regulated knowledge. Survival depended not only on skill and labor, but on the ability to navigate invisible networks. Trade, medicine, education, and even basic necessities were often mediated by trust, secrecy, and discretion. Those who mastered these networks could thrive, while those who miscalculated risked punishment or ruin. Markets and commerce were not free exchanges. Merchants, farmers, and craftsmen operated under close scrutiny. Guilds enforced rules, religious authorities dictated acceptable practices, and rulers taxed, monitored, and regulated. Ordinary transactions were subject to observation, interpretation, and sometimes exploitation. Yet necessity often required bending the rules, working secretly, and cooperating in hidden ways. Survival demanded a dual life: public obedience, private ingenuity. Covert trade was essential. Farmers exchanged goods, artisans passed resources, and merchants discreetly transported wares that were restricted or taxed. These activities relied on careful planning, trusted intermediaries, and concealment. Every transaction carried risk. A single betrayal could destroy livelihoods, provoke fines, or invite imprisonment. Hidden economies were not optional, they were vital to survival. Underground networks extended beyond trade. Knowledge, skills, and ideas were shared secretly. Healers, midwives, and herbalists taught apprentices in private, passing down wisdom that could save lives. Scholars shared manuscripts under the cover of night. Artisans taught innovative techniques discreetly, avoiding the attention of guilds or authorities. These networks were the backbone of resilience, allowing communities to maintain vital knowledge and skills despite pervasive control. Even ordinary households engaged in secret practices. Families concealed resources, preserved herbs and medicines, and passed down instructions for safe survival. Knowledge of safe passage, hidden caches, and trusted allies could determine life or death during famine, plague, or conflict. Discretion became instinctive. Children learned to observe, anticipate, and act without attracting notice. Trust was selective, deliberate, and conditional. Authority tried to control every aspect of life, but it could not completely suppress human ingenuity. People adapted. Hidden markets, covert trades, and clandestine education allowed survival and even progress. Knowledge and skill flourished in secret, creating a parallel society beneath the visible order. These underground networks were fragile, relying on secrecy, loyalty, and careful timing, but they were resilient. The stakes were high. Discovery could be fatal. Guild leaders punished unapproved apprentices, religious authorities prosecuted heretics, local officials fined or imprisoned those who broke trade rules. The mere act of participating in an underground network required constant vigilance. Every movement, word, and gesture had to be calculated for safety. Risk management became a daily survival strategy. Underground knowledge was not merely practical, it was political.
Sharing information could challenge authority, undermine guild monopolies, or empower the disenfranchised. A healer teaching herbal remedies to a neighbor might save lives, but could also attract accusations of witchcraft. A scholar sharing a hidden manuscript might advance science, but also risk execution for heresy. Knowledge was power, but its possession carried danger. Social trust was limited, but essential. People relied on networks of dependable allies, carefully chosen for loyalty, discretion, and competence. Betrayal could destroy years of accumulated knowledge, resources, or alliances. Communities survived by balancing collaboration with caution, maintaining secrecy while ensuring continuity. Relationships became strategic tools, and trust was a calculated commodity. This culture shaped human behavior profoundly. Individuals developed acute observational skills, the ability to read subtle cues, and a deep understanding of social dynamics. Discretion, deception, and planning became everyday skills. Survival required balancing personal needs, communal loyalty, and the invisible threat of authority. Those who mastered these skills thrived. Those who failed suffered. Knowledge transfer was also tactical. Apprentices learned essential skills in stages, often under strict supervision. Forbidden techniques, remedies, or innovations were shared only with the most trusted. Oral tradition, secret manuscripts, and coded instructions allowed the most valuable knowledge to survive despite surveillance. Knowledge itself became a currency of trust. It was shared selectively, and its misuse carried dire consequences. Even ordinary daily activities required caution. Trading, farming, or crafting could inadvertently violate regulations. Hidden caches, underground routes, and secret meetings were commonplace. Communities adapted to surveillance by developing redundant, discrete systems to ensure survival. Flexibility, patience, and careful planning became essential traits. The psychological impact was significant. Individuals internalized vigilance, developed an acute sense of observation and anticipation. Decisions were weighed against potential consequences, and curiosity was tempered by risk assessment. People learned to perform obedience publicly while cultivating hidden competence privately. This duality shaped both personal behavior and community resilience. Underground networks were not static, they evolved. As authorities discovered weaknesses, secret systems adapted. Codes, hidden signals, and clandestine methods allowed communities to stay ahead. Knowledge of social, religious, and economic rules became essential to survival. Understanding when, how, and with whom to act was often as important as the action itself. This hidden world of covert trade, secret learning, and underground cooperation was vital to medieval life. Without it, famine, disease, and oppression would have been far more devastating. Communities relied on these networks to maintain access to essential resources, preserve knowledge, and ensure survival across generations. This was the 15th erased secret of medieval history. Underground networks of trade, knowledge, and skill were essential to survival, progress, and resilience. Ordinary people cultivated skill, wisdom, and innovation in secret, navigating a world dominated by fear, authority, and surveillance. What you knew and how carefully you used it could define your life or end it.
Medieval society was dominated by a combination of power, fear, and secrecy. Authority was maintained not only through law and force, but also through control over information. Kings, nobles, and religious leaders understood that knowledge could destabilize their rule, and they carefully monitored who had access to it. Knowledge was power, but wielding it improperly could be fatal. Literacy was rare, and books were precious. Monks and scribes copied texts painstakingly, but not all texts survived. Works considered dangerous, heretical, or politically inconvenient were destroyed or altered. The written word was both a weapon and a threat. Possessing forbidden knowledge could elevate a person or erase them entirely. Access to learning was therefore both a privilege and a hazard. Literacy could be a crime. Those who could read and interpret texts independently posed a potential threat to authority. Scholars, clerics, and students who pursued forbidden knowledge risked accusations of heresy. Reading itself could be dangerous if it exposed ideas that challenged the established order. Knowledge had to be earned carefully, learned discreetly, and applied cautiously. Practical knowledge, such as medicine, healing, and craftsmanship, was equally perilous. Healers, midwives, and herbalists provided essential services but walked a fine line. A successful remedy or innovative technique could attract envy, suspicion, or accusations of witchcraft. Knowledge of plants, the human body, or chemical processes offered power, but also made one a target. Learning was survival, but survival demanded discretion. Guilds regulated skill and knowledge. Masters controlled what apprentices could learn, supervising their development and restricting unauthorized experimentation. Deviating from approved methods risked punishment, exclusion, or even death. Knowledge was tightly controlled. Innovation existed, but only in carefully sanctioned contexts. The ability to wield knowledge safely became a form of strategic intelligence. Secret networks preserved forbidden knowledge. Scholars, healers, and artisans taught apprentices covertly, passed down oral traditions, and created hidden manuscripts. These clandestine systems allowed survival and the continuation of critical skills. Trust was essential. A single betrayal could destroy years of accumulated wisdom. Underground networks were fragile yet vital, forming the hidden infrastructure of medieval life. Even basic survival required navigating invisible systems. Markets were monitored, resources controlled, and trade regulated. Covert commerce allowed communities to access essential goods, exchange innovations, and maintain survival during times of scarcity. Secret routes, hidden caches, and trusted intermediaries were critical for sustaining communities. Knowledge was not only a tool for advancement, it was a matter of life and death. Religion played a significant role in controlling knowledge. Priests, bishops, and inquisitors monitored behavior, thought, and teaching. Deviations from accepted doctrine could result in punishment, imprisonment, or execution. Yet clandestine practices persisted. Folk medicine, local rituals, and hidden educational networks operated alongside official channels. Communities maintained resilience by preserving dangerous knowledge in secret. Social trust was carefully calibrated. Relationships, alliances, and mentorships were tested rigorously. Knowledge was shared selectively, and loyalty was earned through demonstrated discretion. Betrayal could destroy networks and ruin lives. Communities developed intricate strategies to ensure the safety of knowledge and resources, relying on observation, subtle cues, and careful judgment. Even routine life was strategic. Access to food, water, and safe shelter could be restricted by authorities or competitors. Families relied on hidden stores, secret pathways, and covert cooperation. Communities developed redundancy in knowledge and resources, ensuring continuity in times of crisis. Every decision involved balancing risk, reward, and discretion. Public obedience masked private ingenuity. The psychological impact of this environment was profound. Individuals internalized vigilance, learned to manage behavior, and filtered thoughts carefully. Curiosity had to be weighed against risk, and learning had to be concealed. Public obedience masked private intelligence. Knowledge survived in secret, passed through coded manuscripts, oral lessons, and hidden networks. Those who mastered these systems wielded a subtle but powerful form of influence. Innovation persisted despite danger. Hidden networks enabled experimentation in agriculture, medicine, craftsmanship, and science. Coded manuscripts, secret instruction, and discreet collaboration ensured continuity. Communities survived because knowledge could move safely through underground channels despite pervasive surveillance. The ability to navigate rules while preserving autonomy became essential. Authority reinforced compliance through fear, surveillance, and social pressure. Knowledge was tolerated only when it reinforced existing hierarchies.
Communities internalized these constraints, cultivating habits of vigilance and discretion. Even the most talented or knowledgeable individuals had to navigate constraints carefully. Underground networks enabled resilience and subtle resistance. Knowledge, skill, and innovation flourished in hidden channels. This dual existence, public obedience, private mastery, was essential to medieval life. Communities survived not through freedom, but through strategic secrecy, trust, and adaptability. This was the 16th erased secret of medieval history. Underground networks, hidden knowledge, and covert learning were essential to survival, resilience, and progress. Ordinary people preserved wisdom, skills, and innovation in secret, navigating a world dominated by surveillance, fear, and authority. What you knew and how carefully you used it could define your fate.